With a lot of monsters in Rise, the Yokai-like aspects of the monster have been muted or only acted as inspiration for some small part of it. Gosharag, for instance, does not go around terrifying small children before peacefully returning to the mountains. Aknason does not lick people and then hop away in amusement, and Tetranodon does not rip out people's souls through their anus. Even with some of the more sinister part descriptions and local legends about the monsters, most of them seem simply to be creatures going about their lives in the lands around Kimura, causing trouble only when disturbed or encountered at an inopportunistic time. A lot like many real-world human-wildlife interactions with large wildlife, to be honest. The flagship monster of Monster Hunter Rise, Magnamalo, certainly holds quite a reputation around Kimura Village. The in-game description and intro for it present it less as a monster and more as some manner of malevolent living curse or force of nature, seeking to cause destruction and acting out of pure malice towards living things. It practically has a Devil Joe-like reputation, another monster maligned as a destroyer and evil incarnate, though frankly that may not be deserved at all. Magnamalo's most fearsome aspect is supposedly causing the rampage, in which monsters around the village become enraged and ignore many of their typical behaviours towards one another in laying siege to the village, although in truth Magnamalo is more of a symptom than a cause. Many of Magnamalo's traits and aspects come from its real-world inspirations and from the yokai known as Onibi, and from Japan's variant of ghost, the Yurei, specifically the form of Yurei that appears as ghostly armour haunted by the warrior who died wearing it. So then, let's take a dive and find where legend became reality in Monster Hunter Rise. Yurei is something of a catch-all term analogous for ghosts in the Western world, and encompasses a full range of spectral beings, trapped souls, and spirits, all with their own faint but distinguishable differences. The kanji used for Yurei means faint soul, and according to Japanese beliefs, after death the soul leaves the body and then has to wait for a proper funeral and for rites to be performed for it before it can move on and join its ancestors, find whatever fate is to befall it next, and upon doing so it becomes a protector or guide for the family it left behind. But in some cases this does not come to pass. If the rites are not performed, or the person died in an especially violent manner, or they died plagued with negative emotion, then the ghost becomes a Yurei, returning to the world often to curse or haunt particular places and people until such times it can be laid to rest with ritual or resolving the negative emotions within it. Yurei that are especially violent are termed onryo. Many of the famous examples are wives whose husbands promised not to remarry but promptly did so, leading to the ghost exacting its revenge until it can be pacified. The appearance of Japanese ghosts is quite a standard thing, and will be familiar to any fans of horror films, dressed in white funerary robes with unkempt black hair and hands and feet that move oddly, if limply. But more rare are ghosts of warriors and samurai, especially ones in armour. They certainly do occur, especially after a terrible and ignoble death, but when compared to the ghosts of spurned or betrayed women, they are difficult to find, although a popular enough image despite that. This might be because the warrior tradition it would be noble to die in battle and so would die without regrets, but that's mere speculation on my part. If there is one thing that is conveyed by the intro cinematic, Magnamalo is a creature with an intense grudge against the living, practically a living source of evil that stalks and hunts almost as much out of spite and malice than for actual prey. Naturally, being a monster, this is most likely the anthropomorphization and attributing of negative traits onto Magnamalo on a cultural level. But seeing the past history of Kimura Village with Magnamalo, perhaps this is understandable. With Magnamalo only turning up around the time of the rampage, it must seem like some manner of curse or grudge returning. Although in truth it's simply taking advantage of the rampage rather than having some manner of sinister intent towards the living. Hell, in the rampages in which we actually play in, it will target other monsters just as readily as it will the hunter. But as mentioned in the previous section about Yurei, grudges against the living are a major source of Yurei and onryo hauntings, the negative emotions allowing them to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, and practically everything about Magnamalo's cultural portrayal by the villagers conveys and communicates this nature. Magnamalo's weapons and armour practically all mention negative emotions or aspects that in legends have been attributed to Yurei, mentioning between them the emotions of gluttony, misery, fury, rage, spite, malice, resentment, and madness. The sinister aspects don't even stop there. Some weapons mention Magnamalo's sinister spirit and energy, as though even in death it has not been appeased and will continue to haunt the living, just as an onryo would if the ritual to pacify it has failed. Interestingly, the Palico weapon, made from Magnamalo parts, the sinister tiger lily, even mentions that it is inhabited by the ghost of an ancient warlord, just as the monster's design came about from armor inhabited by an ancient samurai warlord spirit. The pieces for Magnamalo's armor are also sinister and seemingly cursed as well. Each piece mentions dooming the wearer or leading them to ruin, really playing up the grudge and resentment aspect of this monster, Capcom? Finally, the director for Rise mentioned that the original and main inspiration for Magnamalo's physical design came from samurai armor and arms. For instance, the Magnamalo shell is described as an armor-like carapace, and in the intro it is further described as being like tempered steel. The bone-like blades that emerge from Magnamalo's forearms faintly resemble katana, and interestingly the Magnamalo Blade Plus mentions that they can cut a man in two with one swipe, something that katana are famed for both in Japan and in modern pop culture. Indeed, throughout the Edo period, new katana are often given test cuts, often on damp and rolled up tatami mats, a tradition that continues to this day, but also on cadavers or convicted criminals, and some ancient blades have inscriptions to this day that mention how many bodies they successfully cut through. Magnamalo's tail resembles a yari, the Japanese variant and name for a spear, and when the tail is opened up it resembles a Jumonji spear, which are notable for their triple pointed ends. The monster's head with its antlers resemble the striking kabuto helmets of ancient samurai, and the part description for the antlers mention of them echoing the sorrow of slain warriors, quite fittingly. The antler aesthetic in particular makes me think of famed samurai Honda Tadakatsu and Sanada Yukimura, both of whom were famous spear wielders as well. Throughout the world there are rumours and legends of floating balls of light and fire, be it will-o'-the-wisps in England, the Luz Mala in Argentina, or the Alea of Bengal. Tales of strange floating lights are ubiquitous enough that if you dig and research deep enough, you'll find a tale in just about any land. Often these atmospheric ghost fires have some relation to ghosts or the soul, the remains of the dead trapped on Earth, whether positive, neutral, or even negative, wandering and flying through grasslands and marshes in particular. In plenty of cases they cause no direct harm, but lead travellers who mistake them for lanterns off the road into their untimely deaths. Real-world explanations for these folkloric phenomena include ball lightning and bioluminescent fungi, although perhaps the most widely accepted theory is the oxidation of various gases released as part of the decay of organic matter, which ignite upon contact with the air and so very well could be the real-world source for these ephemeral floating fires. Japan not only has yokai that fit the description of these floating balls of light or fire, but has quite an abundance of them. In some places they are the souls of soldiers who linger over battlefields, in others they are balls of flames created by foxes or tengu, or the spirits of trees that bob and weave from tree branches deep within the forests. In Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's four main islands, the dragon god of the sea, Ryujin, creates them on the waters, and they are taken as a sign to not fish. But none of these are quite as sinister as the Onibi, whose name quite literally translates to demon fire, and despite their name they have no relation to the red and blue-skinned Oni of legends. Unlike the vague, wandering ignis fatuus of most other legends, Onibi are practically predatory, swarming the living and draining their life force only to leave a dried, hollowed husk behind. They do not simply rely on curiosity of their victims for this either, so they can manifest the faces and even voices of those whose life force they have drained in the past to draw in new victims. They often rise from the bodies of dead humans and animals, with powerful grudges and malice often being a contributing cause, much like with the Yurei and Onryo. Magnamalo's Hellfire Blight is based on Onibi, as mentioned earlier. This is especially apparent in the intro cinematic, in which a ball of Hellfire Blight floats along through the bamboo grove whilst Tobi Kadachi flees it. The way it moves, even the height off the ground, is how tales of Ignis Fatuus often described, about 2 or so meters off the ground, but rather than moving away as in most variants of the stories, it actively approaches Tobi Kadachi, echoing how Onibi will move towards and swarm the living. In the poem that accompanies the intro, it is mentioned that the purple hellfire will steal the final breath of its prey, quite literally draining away the life of the creature itself, much like how Onibi is said to do so for the living. The Magna Ghost Prism mentions that it is a gaseous crystal that emits flammable gas resembling dancing purple flames, quite fittingly. But more interesting for our purposes is the purple Magnamalo orb. The description for this part mentions that its glow is as though it holds many unfortunate souls. Magnamalo must have learned a trick or two from Tetranodon at some point. Apart from the obvious reference in which some forms of Ignis Fatuus in Japan are said to be the souls of the recently deceased, it might have the added aspect that Onibi take on the faces and voices of those that they have drained of life, holding bits of soul, just like this orb. Finally, in Magnamalo's actual attacks, the Onibi motif continues when it is using its Hellfire. Magnamalo has several ranged options to attack the hunter, be it releasing dust that explodes in a manner not unlike that of Teostra's, and of course its Hellfire beam. But this particular attack on screen at the moment is the one most of interest to us, as Magnamalo releases spheres of ignited Hellfire that resemble Onibi the most out of all of its moveset. Fortunately, the Rise development team did not give it more ranged options than this, and did not turn Magnamalo's fight into a bullet hell level. With the wealth of Japanese Yokai lore to call back on, I'm glad that Capcom went for what it did with Magnamalo. Whilst a monster based on the more standard folklore of Yokai would have been interesting, I'm not sure that some sort of wyvern inspired by the Ring or the Grudge would quite fit with what the team had intended for Rise. Maybe we'll have some sort of Halloween event in future with Ragnar Kadaki getting long black hair and making all manner of creepy rasping sounds to do though. Do you like Magnamalo and its inspiration from Japanese folklore when it comes to Yokai and Onibi? If so, please let me know. And thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far through this series. And until next time, happy hunting everyone.